whether we're going to address the backlog of the 28,000 young people waiting to access mental health services in this province, and how we need to make mental health part of OHIP because mental health is health. I think of the women who are struggling in minimum wage jobs. I think of the women who care for our loved ones and have been disrespected and underpaid prior to this pandemic, but especially during this pandemic. I think of the women who have experienced more gender-based violence during this pandemic. We cannot afford to wait to address these issues. We can't have a debate when my daughter is my age saying, oh, it was a historic conversation when I was in high school, but we still haven't solved these problems. And so together, let's have a conversation tonight how we're going to deliver the solutions to build the Ontario all of you want and need.
That's time. Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Thank you so much, leaders. Now let's get to the fun part, the questions. Clean water and a healthy planet make all life possible. So that is where we begin. There are many Indigenous communities across Ontario that still don't have access to clean water. They live with boil water advisories and have done so for many years. The issue of clean water is about protecting source water, and that is where the provincial government has a role. Protecting source water is a responsibility of the provincial government because the watershed extends outside reserves. We're happy to introduce Leila Stats, who will ask the first question. Leila Stats is Mohawk, Turtle Clan from the Six Nations of the Grand River. She is a filmmaker, a musician, and water protector. Her most recent film is a documentary called Blood and Water, a story of reclamation. Leila will ask the question and the follow-up. Go ahead, Leila.
Nyawa. Sego, Skanagoaga, Leila Stats Young Yats, Anawara Niwa Git Daroden, Ganyak Gehaga, Niwa Got Wendroden. I want to first acknowledge the fact that we're here to discuss women's issues and the fact that it hasn't been a topic since I was born in 1984 is something I want to bring awareness to. As a Haudenosaunee woman, in our community, we are a matriarch society. Women's voices are upheld, they are honored, they are respected. They are the decision makers. So my question tonight has two parts. As an Indigenous woman, it is seen as one of our roles and responsibilities to protect and uphold the water. This was given to us from Creator. Currently, there are 36 boil water advisories. Some of them have existed for over 25 years. My own community on Six Nations, less than 10% have access to clean water. Something we take for granted as we turn our taps on. And I want you to think about the state that we were in when we ran out of toilet paper. Imagine if that was water. So my question, what will your solution to the clean water crisis in First Nations communities be, and how you will resource these initiatives? And secondly, and maybe most importantly, is what are some of the strategies that you'll implement to ensure Indigenous women voices, the traditional voices of the water, will be central to these solutions? How are you going to identify and remove the barriers that they face in that participation? Nyawa, thank you.
Thank you. We'll start with Mr. Schreiner. You'll have 2 minutes, and then Ms. Horvath and Mr. Del Duca will have 1 minute to respond, and then Mr. Schreiner, you'll have an opportunity to respond to what they said. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Leila, first of all, thank you for the question, and I also just want to say thank you to all the Indigenous women, and especially Jan Sherman in my writing, who's a water keeper and have taught me so much about the importance of protecting the water that runs through my community, the Speed River, which ultimately flows into the Grand and through Six Nations. You know what? Let's be clear. The water challenges we face is essentially environmental racism in action. And let's be honest about it as a society, and let's solve it. And let's not solve it through jurisdictional ping pong balls. Like, I get so tired of that. Let's actually, if the federal government's not going to solve it, then I think the provincial government has a responsibility to solve water issues within the boundaries of the province of Ontario. And if the federal government wants to pay the province for it sometime in the future, they can do that. We need to train Indigenous people to make sure they can operate those clean water systems. And I'm proud to say that the Ontario Greens Climate Plan has a $1 billion commitment for Indigenous-led climate and nature-based solutions. As the original stewards of this land for time immemorial, we need Indigenous leadership to show us the pathway forward to climate justice and climate resiliency. I also want to say that I'm proud of just yesterday announced a plan to double the size of Ontario's Greenbelt, to create a Blue Belt, something I did in consultation with Indigenous peoples, so we protect the waterways and the moraines and the wetlands that protect us from flooding, that clean our drinking water. And I want to close by saying we need to work together to crush climate pollution so all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have a livable future.
Ms. Horvath?
Thanks very much, Nam, and thank you, Leila Nyawe, for the question. I've had the opportunity to visit Six Nations many times. I'm from Hamilton, and so I'm a neighbor. But I've also had the opportunity to spend time in communities around the province. I've been to Niskandaga, I've been to Atwapiskat, I've been to Grassy Narrows, I've been to a number of the reserves that have struggled for a very long time with those boiled water advisories, and it's unthinkable that here in 2022, although we know this has been going on in some cases like Niskandaga for decades, the water continues to not be drinkable. And in fact, in that First Nation, the chief was telling me a story not too long ago about the fact that his kids, who are teenagers now, in fact, a couple of his kids are in their 20s, when they go to Thunder Bay, they don't drink the tap water in the hotel because they're afraid, because they've been taught that it's going to poison them. This is not acceptable. For a long time, we've been saying Ontario needs to fix the water and send the bill to Ottawa, and that's my commitment.
Mr. Del Duca?
Well, thanks very much, Leila, for the question. As both Mr. Schreiner and Ms. Horvath have said, it's obviously an issue that's been talked about for a very long time. I know that I'm quite convinced, fed up, as most of us are, about this idea, as Mike said, of these jurisdictional squabbles. The bottom line is that in a province as prosperous and as wealthy and as innovative as Ontario, drinking water shouldn't make you sick. You know, the water that's in our lakes and our rivers shouldn't, for example, cause cancer. The Ontario Liberal Plan, which we will be unveiling in the short term, will provide dedicated resources, significant resources, to make sure that people can do what they should be able to do, including Indigenous people, turn on the taps and have that support, have that good health coming from the water itself. I do think that we have this amazing ability in Ontario to build large-scale infrastructure, but the fact that this problem continues to plague us, to me, is totally unacceptable. So my time is about to run out, but I think we're going to have more of a chance to answer this in greater detail in just a moment, as soon as Nam tells us we can.
That's time.
There we go, see?
Leila, did you have a follow-up?
Hello. So I appreciate your responses, and I'm glad to hear that this is on the top of your minds as well. Again, bringing back that question of including women's voices. I think that also brings up the question of awareness to our Indigenous wisdom and education, and acknowledging and recognizing that, and giving women a larger space, a bigger voice, a more significant voice when it comes to issues of land and water development, some of the plans that you have in place. So my question again is how to include our voices.
And you have 3 minutes.
Oh, so I do want to say, Leila, that you've really raised an important issue, as others have said. As we deal with not only things like how do we fix the water, but you also mentioned development. We know that there are requirements around engagement, but what we need to do is make sure that engagement is broad and inclusive in terms of the women's voices and their perspectives. Because yes, women are the traditional water carriers, but they're also the givers of all life, as is water. And so we are definitely committed to making sure that everything that we plan and everything that we do centers Indigenous voices and acknowledges and recognizes that women's voices are extremely important in all of these dialogues. And when we've seen government after government not respect the treaties and not respect the government-to-government relationship and not respect the principles of prior informed consent, we know that there's a lot of work to do. And so I look forward to being able to form a government in a couple of weeks' time and start really doing justice alongside, in partnership with Indigenous voices, First Nations communities, and start fixing what's been going wrong for far too long.
I'm just going to interject and say, Mr. Del Duca, Mr. Schreiner, you can jump in anytime. This is the time you get
I don't want to
know
interrupt. Sure, I'll go. Okay. And then you want to close? I'll save you some time.
This will be the most polite debate anybody's been in.
I want to say that when it comes to, we all are treaty people, and we all have treaty obligations, and we have to fulfill those commitments. And whether it's in land, water, free and informed prior consent before the approval of development proposals, whether it's training Indigenous peoples to be leaders on their own lands, to direct solutions by providing funding to support that. I can't tell you how many Indigenous leaders, I think of Chief Laraka at Mississauga's Scugog Island. She was an amazing advocate when we worked so hard together to stop the Amazon warehouse on the Duffins Creek wetland. And she told me, you know what? We never get funding for this. We never get financial support for this. It always comes out of our own pockets, and we're already under so much pressure. So let's support Indigenous peoples to provide that leadership on their land.
And I'll pick up on that last point, because I think one of the real missed opportunities that we've had in Ontario for decades is that a provincial government comes in and invests, in some cases, billions of dollars in critical infrastructure. And as soon as the project is done, we kind of go back to going on to the next project, instead of leaving a lasting economic legacy for Indigenous people to get proper capacity building, financial support, to become entrepreneurs that I know you want to become, so that you can actually then grow from there.
I felt bad saying that because
That's
you
okay.
had the least amount of time.
We're just getting started, so it's all good.
Sorry,
Thank
Stephen,
you
I should have left
okay.
you a few more minutes.
That's okay,
there.
Mike.
If I was to say Jerry, would you, and anyone in here know what I'm talking about? We need that Jerry-like energy for the 3-minute debate. Everyone's nice. Our second question focuses on minimum wage. More than 1 million people in Ontario work for minimum wage. 60% of minimum wage workers are women. 42% are women who are recent immigrants. Women working for minimum wage are disproportionately racialized. A report released by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives last week showed that Black women gained the most from the 2018 increase to minimum wage. That report also showed that employment increased after the 2018 minimum wage hike. In fact, just 6 months ago, Ontario-born economist David Card won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his research, proving that increasing the minimum wage doesn't lead to job losses. On January 1st of this year, the government raised the minimum wage to $15. Last week, Premier Ford announced that the minimum wage would rise to $15.50 in October. In last week's Environics poll, 80% of respondents say raising the minimum wage is important to promoting women's economic equality. Julie works for minimum wage in Toronto. She is asking her question in a pre-recorded video on leaders. You can look at the video in that monitor over there. And Dina Ladd, Executive Director of the Workers' Action Centre, will ask the follow-up question. And Ms. Horvath will respond first, and then Mr. Del Duca, and then Mr. Schreiner. If we can roll the video, please.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a mother and I work 2 part-time jobs to support my family. A $15 minimum wage is not enough to live on. My family lives from paycheck to paycheck. Each part of my paychecks covers our basic expense, rent, food, and my child's need. If Ford Conservative government did not cancel the $15 minimum wage and froze it for 2 years, I would be earning $15.75. But that is not enough. I'm campaigning for a $20 minimum wage. This is important for women, especially for women of color, and it will help close the gender wage gap. My question is, if elected, will you commit to raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour for all workers, including student and farm workers?
All of you have 1 minute for this, and Ms. Horvath will start.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the question. It's very clear that minimum wage has fallen behind it from successive governments. And the unfortunate thing that we've watched too many times is the minimum wage discussion becomes a campaign gimmick. It's happened in the past. We saw what happened in 2018, a last-minute change to minimum wage, and then, of course, Mr. Ford canceled that as soon as he came into office, costing people a significant amount of money, $5,300 to $6,000 for all of those minimum wage workers. Now, of course, an election's on again, and the gimmicks are starting again. It's unacceptable. We've put together a very thoughtful plan to move the minimum wage to $20 an hour. We've already made that commitment, and proudly so. And it starts this year, in fact, with a change in October to 16, and then every May for the next several years, a $1 increase until we get to 20, which will be in 2026. And we are very, very proud of that plan.
Mr. Del Duca?
It's such an important question, you know, and it's a place where real leadership is needed at this moment in time. I've said this repeatedly. I don't think that we will ever successfully deliver maximum economic dignity if we're constantly attaching ourselves to minimum standards and minimum requirements. We have seen for generations now a never-ending race to the bottom for workers and their families. So Ontario Liberals and our plan for economic dignity have already confirmed that if elected June 2nd, we will move the minimum wage to $16 an hour to start. But then it is my goal, it is our goal to move quickly, working with everybody who is interested, including with people in this audience tonight and watching from home, to move as quickly as we can to deliver for the first time ever a dynamic and regionally adjusted living wage for people. We're standing here in Toronto this evening. We know that $16, $17, $18 an hour is not enough. We need to do better than this, and we have the capacity in this province to deliver on a real living wage for Ontario's workers and their families.
Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, let's be honest. Nobody can survive in this city and most major cities across this province on the current minimum wage. Takes the average minimum wage worker 85 hours of work just to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. Like who can survive on that? And so absolutely we need to increase the minimum wage. The Ontario Greens proposal is to use the regional guaranteed living wage formula to develop a living wage in communities across this province. And so it would be a wage that would be based on the cost of living. In Toronto, right now, that would be $22.08. It's the highest in the province, as you would expect. In a community like Sault Ste. Marie, it would be $16.20. And in many communities across the province, it would fall. That's the lowest in the province, by the way. And in many communities across the province, it would range in between that based on the cost of living.
Mr. Schreiner, I have to interrupt. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Ms. Horvath, you have an opportunity, 30 seconds, to respond to anything that Mr. Del Duca or Mr. Schreiner said.
Thanks very much, Nam. I do have to say that we spent a long time trying to get, with all due respect, Mr. Del Duca's government to increase the minimum wage, and at the very last minute, it was done, and it didn't stick, obviously. We know that people need and deserve economic dignity. We know that 60% of the people that are working minimum wage jobs are women, and that is not acceptable. Yes, I agree with both of these guys that a living wage is necessary, but let's not wait. Let's get people wages that they deserve right away.
So we're going to have a follow-up question from Dina Ladd, and after her question, you have the opportunity of 3 minutes to debate back and forth. And you don't have to be as polite as before. We like the politeness, but
It's in our nature.
Dina, go ahead.
Sometimes.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So as you know, the minimum wage is a topic that's very close to the heart of the Workers' Action Centre. Workers in our province have faced decades of income inequality, and we've been talking about that. But a lot of that has to do with systemic inequality that's built into the fabric of the labour market due to wages, precarious employment, lack of protection. And so I'm here to give a reality check, right? That's my job. And so I'm really challenging the Liberals and the Greens, because I didn't really know that you were actually supporting the regional living wage thing. I want to talk about that. I really am incredibly worried that the two of you and your parties are putting that forward. Your platform in terms of creating regional differential minimum wages based on different regions in Ontario instead of raising the floor of wages for across the province. There are some significant problems with this, and so I'm going to just kind of outline a few, and I really hope I can change your mind around your thinking this through. So regional living wage calculations are based on an ideal, and I'm going to put this in quotes, an ideal family type. 2 healthy adults, both working 35 hours a week, with 2 children aged 7 and 3. They're meeting the basic needs in a given region. The framework sets out the living wage based on what 2 wage earners in this family of 4 need to earn per hour to meet basic expenses. This factors in costs of housing, transportation, childcare, food, as well as tax credits. This calculation reproduces inequality as it does not consider single family parents. It does not, it really should be based on a single person and not on the presumption that you should even have children. The problem also becomes really apparent when you know that the living wage is being tested on social spending. Wages should not be means tested to social spending. If we in the community actually are successful as, let's say, in lowering public transportation costs, lowering childcare costs, for instance, as an example, these gains should not be cancelled out through reductions in the living wage, which is exactly what happens right now, right? The other problem, secondly, why should workers who live in downtown Toronto make a higher minimum wage than workers living in the Peel region? The structures of racism through the housing market and the labor market shape who lives where in our cities and our provinces. The regional living wage model would not just fail to rectify this, it would reinforce and accentuate existing inequalities in the labor market. John Stapleton has talked about the increased Manhattanization of Toronto, which has lots and lots of workers pouring in from the suburbs to do essential work in downtown Toronto. So how do we calculate who gets paid what wage? Based on where people are living or working? Who's to say a woman who's cleaning in Hamilton or in Sault Ste. Marie is worth less than someone living in Toronto? So not ensuring universality of the minimum wage floor means opening the door further for employers to threaten to move their operations from one region to a lower wage region. This would disempower workers from fighting for higher wages, stronger protections and benefits. If workers are paid based on their postal code, this will silence workers and create more fear in the workplace. I don't think that that's what you want. I think that you should reevaluate your proposals. I think you should move into a universal raising standards for all workers, regardless of where they live and regardless of where they work. That's what we need. So, as you know, I'm getting to my question. As you know, the current government, our fearless leader, decided not to come today, but he just passed Bill 88, which excludes gig workers from getting full employment rights and a minimum wage for all hours worked. We have many other workers who are also excluded from minimum wage, such as migrant farm workers, workers who are truck drivers, cleaners who are also misclassified and don't get minimum standards or wages. If you are elected, will you ensure that there are no exemptions to workers getting minimum wage, and in particular gig workers, migrant farm workers, and those workers who are misclassified as independent contractors? Will you make sure that they get full access to basic employment standards and the minimum wage in Ontario? Thank you.
Great stuff. All right. Good questions. I'm gonna jump in.
Go ahead.
So, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And there's almost nothing in what you described that I would tell you that I disagree with or Ontario Liberals disagree with. But I just want to make sure that it's clearly understood. And this is why I carefully chose my words both when I first announced back on March 26th what our plan was relating to the minimum wage and what I said here tonight. I didn't come to this discussion saying I have a preordained formula and outcome that I know will do the right thing by every single worker in this province vis-a-vis the living wage. What I have said throughout is that after we move the floor, that universality, up to $16 an hour, Ontario Liberals will work with all partners, including you, including the Workers' Action Centre, other political parties that are interested in progress, so that we can develop a dynamic, and that's a word I purposely and deliberately use to describe our plan, a dynamic, regionally adjusted living wage. That doesn't mean I can tell you tonight that I know what the right rate is in Toronto versus Wawa. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that I know for sure where even the boundaries necessarily need to be drawn. I need your input. Earlier tonight in my introduction, I talked about listening. I talked about collaboration. One of the biggest challenges we have in Ontario right now is the top-down leadership that we get from Premier Doug Ford and the Ford Conservatives. That has to end. We need to build our solutions for progress from the grassroots up, and that's something that I am committed to doing. The other thing I'll mention quickly is that the minimum wage and living wage idea that's in our Liberal plan for economic dignity is one important piece of the whole plan. So properly identifying workers who are in the gig economy, providing portable benefits, a floor of safety, a real firm floor that you can stand on for your entire career. That's part of our plan. 10 paid sick days. Yes, the living wage, designed with your help and input. It's an entire package that will, for the first time in more than a generation, put workers and their families right at the top of the list and keep them there, because we won't have the kind of economy that I'll be proud of in this province, an economy that I want my daughters to thrive in, if we don't do it the right way. So you have my ironclad commitment that we will work with you and everyone else
Mr.
to make sure that we get it right.
Mr.
Thank you very
Horvath
much.
and Mr. Schreiner
Thank you very
should say
much.
something,
Appreciate
Mr.
it.
Deluca.
Yeah.
You've
So
got 20
thank
seconds
you.
each.
So thank you for that. Yes, I mean, in debate, the misclassification of gig workers, seasonal farm workers, and independent contractors absolutely has to be fixed. We can't have second-class workers in Ontario. We need to have everybody covered in the Employment Standards Act. Our interest in a guaranteed living wage is to start taking the politics and the election gimmicks out of minimum wages and ensure that the minimum wage actually meets people's cost of living. Happy to work with you on the details to formulate that.
I just want to say, Dina, thank you for reminding us why we're having this conversation in the first place. Women's labor has been devalued. This is an example of what's wrong with not valuing equally the labor of every worker.
Listen, I'll say this again. When we have the debate time, you got to share the time or duke it out.
Yeah, we're just getting used to the format.
Well, we're only halfway through, so. We are in the sixth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has shown us the importance of physical distancing and staying home from work when sick. 1.6 million workers in Ontario don't have permanent protection for paid sick days. 70% of low-wage workers who were so essential during the pandemic have no access to paid sick days. Again, the pandemic is not over yet. At the end of April 2021, the Conservative government introduced 3 paid sick days, which can be used only where the absence is specifically related to 1, COVID, 2, COVID vaccination, or 3, COVID-related public health orders. But these paid sick days are temporary. They will end on July 31st, 2022. Gloria Attorney will ask the leaders about their plans for paid sick days. Gloria is a home care worker represented by SEIU, and the follow-up question will be asked by Yasmin Beydoun from the Decent Work and Health Network. And the response, Mr. Schreiner will be responding first, and then Mr. Del Duca, and then Ms. Horvath, and Mr. Schreiner will have time to respond. Go ahead, Gloria.
Hey, Gloria.
As Nan says, my name is Gloria Attorney, and I want to tell you about me. I'm an home care worker, a PSW who works in the community. Means I go from home to home every day, sun, snow, whatever it is. Most time people talk about long-term care and they think about going into the brick and mortar, having backup every day, but we don't have that. If I don't work 1,352 hours this year, I have no health benefits next year. If I get sick, I don't get paid because I have absolutely no paid sick days. I'm a single mother, I'm an immigrant, and 36 years ago, I started my first job in Jamaica. Yes, I'm 53.
You look good, Gloria.
Don't believe it. Don't believe it.
36
Here, here.
years ago, I started my first job in what is considered a third world country. And I had guaranteed 10 paid sick days, 14 departmental days. Yeah. I was disappointed, annoyed, coming to what is said to be a first world country. We're working in healthcare, taking care of all those people who broke their backs years ago to make Canada what it is, that I now don't have paid sick days. Recently I got sick and I literally had to go into grievance mode to be paid for those 3 days, even though this government has given us those 3 days. Because as Nan says, there are stipulations to how you get these paid days. I am hoping that COVID has taught you the lessons that we have been trying to teach you, well, long before I came to Canada. I have been here now 12 years, and ever since the day I landed here, we have been saying this, we've been shouting, we need paid sick days. I want to ask each of you tonight, 1, hope you have learned the lessons. 2, come June 2nd, if you are elected, will you guarantee workers like myself and other women and men who put their lives on the line every single day to ensure that there's a place for our seniors, at least a minimum of 10 paid sick days?
Thank you.
Mr. Schreiner?
Thank you, Gloria. And the Ontario Greens absolutely support bringing in 10 paid sick days. I want to thank you for a moment for your service and your caring service during the pandemic especially. I mean, the bottom line is home and community care workers are vastly underpaid. You should be guaranteed full-time work. You should be paid for your mileage in between seeing people. You should have backup and support, and I know you don't have it. And our elders and people with disabilities and others who you care for pay the price for that. And so it's in all of our interests. It's in every single Ontarian's interest to ensure that all workers in this province have 10 paid sick days. Nobody should have to choose between going to work sick or putting food on the table and paying the bills. And we can do this in a way to address concerns that small businesses and others might have. But the bottom line is we need paid sick days.
Mr. Del Duca?
Well, thanks very much, Gloria, for your service and for your passion. It's evident that the work you do is a real vocation for you. I want to echo what Mike Schreiner said a second ago. Ontario Liberals, as part of our plan to deliver economic dignity, will deliver those 10 paid sick days that you've talked about, that we think are the right thing to do for workers and their families. And I know I don't have to convince, I think, people who are in this room or watching from home tonight. Isn't it appalling? In fact, it's disgusting to think about what the Ford Conservatives chose to do, about how callous their approach was. Frankly, their approach was cruel. To eliminate the paid sick leave program that existed in 2018, and then to wait more than 400 days to restore a half-hearted measure. Not good enough, but we will make it happen. Thank you.
Ms. Horvath, you have 30 seconds.
Thanks very much, Gloria, for all the work that you do. And I think it's important that you note that people prefer home care. People prefer to stay in their home and get home care where they are and not be uprooted into long-term care. But you're absolutely right. We've disrespected the largely women, mostly women, that work in community care, and that's not acceptable. 10 paid sick days absolutely is our commitment. I can tell you, had we formed government last time, we would have paid sick days, not just 2 measly paid sick days, with all due respect, but paid sick days, 10 paid sick days, and in a pandemic, 14 paid by the government.
Mr. Schreiner, you have 30 seconds to respond to anything that they said.
Yeah, I just, in the interest of being nonpartisan, I see the member from London West is here, and I know she put forward, that's what we say in the House. She's a member of the NDP caucus and put forward legislation for 10 paid sick days. And I believe all 3 of the parties up here voted for that. I think if we've learned anything from this pandemic, it is that workers should never, ever, ever again in this province have to choose between putting food on the table or going into work sick.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have a follow-up from Yasmin, and afterwards we have 3 minutes for debate. But if anyone here. It's taking up too much time. I will have to interject, and it's not polite to interrupt, but I will do it. Okay? I will do it. Yasmin, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Yasmin, and I'm a healthcare provider working in the acute care setting in the GTA, where I'm still seeing patients that are sick and can't take time off of work. I myself, as a healthcare provider, also do not have access to paid sick days. The current 3 temporary days under the WIPB is not the protection my patients deserve. Health workers have been clear throughout the pandemic, and I want to echo Gloria, that our patients need at least 10 permanent paid sick days and an additional 14 days during public health emergencies. Adequate paid sick days are an essential public health policy, especially for women. The Decent Work in Health Network's new groundbreaking report, it's incredible, everyone should read it, has stated that women have been at the forefront of this pandemic, with at least 70% of healthcare workers, many of whom are racialized and new immigrants, are consequently exposed to the economic risks associated with this crisis. However, I want to emphasize that seamless access is an integral pillar of an effective policy. This means that paid sick days must be employer paid. It was encouraging to see that all 3 of you support recent legislation such as Bill 8, Bill 7, and Bill 239 that would have provided 10 employer paid sick days and 2 additional weeks. Even the federal government and the provincial BC government have moved on an employer paid sick days. I want to remind leaders here today that any program with unnecessary waiting periods that require workers or employers to file for reimbursement or to access paid sick days through an application process is an accessibility barrier. Many folks cannot, get paid sick days. I myself gave up with the process as well. Right. I am also astonished that we're expected to subsidize businesses at a time when big businesses have made record-breaking profits during this pandemic, including for-profit long-term cares, especially at the expense of workers and their safety in our communities. An effective paid sick day policy is one legislated under the Employment Standards Act that requires employers to provide them as part of a worker's employment right. Effective paid sick day policy must be adequate, employer paid, and seamlessly accessible to all, and there should be no barriers. My question is, can you clarify, if elected, if your policy will follow principles on effective paid sick days, including being permanent, adequate, fully employer paid, and seamlessly accessible for all workers? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yasmin, for the question and for giving us an opportunity to clarify. And I also want to thank Mike for mentioning Peggy Sattler, who has been a leader at the Ontario Legislature on the paid sick days file, as well as the issues that Dina was talking about earlier in terms of precarious work in the gig economy. So Peggy's a superstar, and what we've done is put together exactly the kind of plan you're talking about. Not a plan that includes things like barriers to access, application processes, doctor's notes, which is something that Mr. Ford favors. What we need is an ability for workers to stay home when they're sick and not worry about their paycheck being light at the end of that pay period. That's something we can do and we should do, and as Gloria said, other jurisdictions are successfully doing that. And it's a shame that here we are in 2022, and you're right, that the pandemic has shown us exactly how much paid sick days could have helped to keep people safe, to prevent workplace outbreaks, and to do the right thing by working people. Nobody should have to make that decision. I think that's what Mike said about going to work sick or being worried that you can't pay the bills. Absolutely, we're 100% in favor of paid sick days, employer paid sick days. But I do say during a pandemic—
I have to interject because we need time for the other— During a pandemic, we can talk further about some of my thoughts around that.
Okay. So I'll jump in here quickly, and I'll leave time, Mike, I promise. So thank you very much, Yasmin, for your question and for the work that you do. So the short answer is yes. I want to give one caveat or one asterisk to the yes. You talked about big business and how profitable it's been for them, and I get that completely. But we also know that in Ontario, small businesses have really had a very tough time, many of them, over the past couple of years. In our plan for economic dignity, we do talk about the 10 paid sick days as being guaranteed, But I just want to be clear, we do propose to provide some transitional financial support for small businesses who've been hit hardest during the pandemic to make this, I'll say, bridging a little bit easier for them as they're getting back up on their feet, paying down pandemic-related debts, and hoping, hopefully continue to prosper. So yes, but just that one caveat, so we're very clear. Mike, over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll be very clear as well.
Oops, sorry.
Permanent, paid, 6 days, seamless. You wake up in the morning, you're feeling sick, you know you can stay home, you know your paycheck's not going to be deducted later, you have no application you have to apply for. I do believe when it comes to small businesses that a small business at a later time should be able to apply for some help, given how many small businesses have struggled. But yes, employer paid for big businesses, no doubt about it. And I want to say, as somebody who was a longtime small business owner, it's good for businesses to have healthy employees who don't come to work sick.
You're here. Good stuff.
Thank you. You were all kind of on time. Yay! So we're halfway through the program. And so we wanted to kind of change the pace a little bit because we want to get to know you a little bit better beyond the politician, because politicians politic.
Never.
We just wanted to get a sense of you personally. Sure. I don't know how many people here have been caregivers or parents during the pandemic, but it's kind of felt like the pandemic was like 55 years long. A lot of humbling moments during that period. So my question to all of you, and I'll start with Mr. Schreiner because he's not trying to take my job like you are, Mr. Del Duca. As a parent or a caregiver, in what ways has the pandemic humbled you, Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, I think it just humbled me in the sense of just how overwhelming it can be to be disconnected from people, to not be able to have those personal interactions with folks. Because I know for my own mental well-being, those types of connections are so critical and valuable. And my heart goes out to my daughters. My oldest daughter, like her last year of university, was all online and didn't have the opportunity to have those experiences. My youngest daughter's like first couple years of high school, all online. If there was ever an advertisement, and if I can get political here for a second, if there was ever an advertisement to not have mandatory online learning, the pandemic was that case. So my gosh, let's invest in our schools. Let's invest in our public systems of care for each other, because this pandemic for me has just highlighted so much how important those personal connections to people are.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Ms. Horvath?
Thanks for the question. I think the thing that humbled me the most during the entire pandemic, and we're still not over it yet, I think we have to be very thoughtful about that, is that I had the privilege of not worrying about my paycheck. And I watched as PSWs went into homes and communities, as Leonard Rodriguez didn't get the PPE that he needed and ended up losing his life to COVID-19. Talking to his wife was horrifying. Hearing what his family went through was terrible. Knowing that people in minimum wage jobs were going to work, risking their health, risking their lives to stock our shelves, to fill up the warehouse shelves, to take care of people, and knowing that as they did that work and were at risk of getting sick, they didn't have things like paid sick days to fall back on. I was very humbled by the privilege that I had to acknowledge I have during the pandemic.
Thank you. Mr. Del Duca?
Well, I think that, for me, I'll call it humbling. I think that's the right way to describe it. In the work that we have the honor of doing, we're often far away from home or not at home as much as we would otherwise be. And I mentioned earlier tonight that my daughters are a little bit younger than Mr. Schreiner's. They're 14 and 10 and grade 8 and grade 4 last year. And having the chance to be around them, frankly, an awful lot more than was the case when I was running for leader or when I served as a cabinet minister or an MPP previously, was actually pretty remarkable. So I know that COVID has been brutally tough for so many, but gaining that opportunity to be up close with them and to literally watch them go through the struggle and the isolation of trying to do school online, which was horrifically difficult for so many, listening to them, seeing them grow, seeing them struggle with those challenges as it relates to COVID was really something that was humbling. And it's just the kind of thing that I didn't expect a couple of years ago that I would have gained that insight into their lives at this stage, given the work that we do. So I'm grateful for that, but it was humbling.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that. That question leads well into our next topic, which is childcare. In 1970, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women recommended that a national childcare strategy be adopted as one of the key policy changes needed for women to have economic equality. It has taken more than 50 years, but we may be close. The 2021 federal budget committed to fund a national $10 a day childcare system. It set aside $30 billion over 5 years with an ongoing commitment of $9.2 billion after that. Ontario was the last province to sign the federal childcare funding agreement. It was signed on March 27th. And now the hard work starts of putting it in place. Let me introduce Jess Tomas, a frontline childcare worker and community organizer for the Association for Early Childhood Educators of Ontario. Jess will ask the question, and Carolyn Ferns, Executive Director of the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, will ask the follow-up question. And again, you have 3 minutes to debate that. So Jess, take it away.
Thank you. So I have been an early childhood educator in Toronto for over 10 years. And the last 2 years have changed my work drastically. I remember feeling like my job was unrecognizable. And, Andrea had also mentioned about having that paycheck. I myself was laid off for 6 months. The stress and the downloading of that stress onto our frontline workers, we are essential workers, but didn't feel like we were treated as essential. And I'm thinking about how much I want to stay in this field, how much I want to use the training and skills and experience that I've gotten, I've paid for, I've earned, but I don't see, I really struggle to see how I'm supposed to sustain this alongside all of my other early childhood educators. So many have already left the field, and given that we have now Ontario committing 86,000 new spots, the reality is we're in a workforce recruitment and retention crisis.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen a childcare center before where supply was needed, it is absolutely to the bare bones now. And I will say with my full chest out, childcare workers are hanging on by a thread. And the deal that we've been presented with still hasn't prioritized us in the grand scheme of this. So we talk about the 86,000 spaces. I want to know what your party is going to do to directly address the workforce crisis so that there are enough early childhood educators to even expand in the way that has already been promised.
Mr. Del Duca, you'll start, then Ms. Horvath, Mr. Schreiner, and then Del Duca, you'll have 1 minute, yep. And then you have time to respond to their comments. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Jess, so much for being here and for your question. At one point in her career, my mom was an early childhood educator years before the crisis, the ordeal that COVID has been. So, I do have a degree of understanding from that era what it was like to do the work that you do. I will tell you that the Ontario Liberal plan for $10 a day licensed childcare, we call it Care for Every Child, in terms of helping bring more women in particular, into the profession. We would be providing free college tuition to become an early childhood educator, and then we would move to take the salary and benefits compensation package and put it on the exact same footing that we have right now in the full day kindergarten system for ECEs in the province, to basically raise up that standard. So supporting people coming into the profession, but also helping to retain them by honoring the work that you do, for paying you properly, and for respecting you for the work that you do to give Ontario's kids their very best start in life. That's the Ontario Liberal plan. Thank you.
Ms. Horvath?
Thanks very much, and thank you for the wonderful work that you do as an early childhood educator, and all of your colleagues as well. It's extremely important to the well-being of our children, the ability of women to engage in the workforce, and really puts kids, as we know, on a strong path when it comes to learning and success in the future. What we did this morning is make our announcement on early childhood education and childcare, because we know how important it is to do exactly what you talk about. We have to expand. We've committed to nonprofit expansion, but we've also committed to increasing the wages right away to $25 an hour for ECEs, RECs, as well as 20 for others in the workforce. But it's more than just that. It's engaging with the sector, with the unions, to work out the grid process going forward, to make sure that these are good jobs forever, including pensions and benefits, including planning time, so that you can really excel in your really important profession.
Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, Jess, thanks for the question and thanks for your service. And there is no way, like, let's just be honest with people. There is no way we will be able to fulfill all the spaces we need to fill with early childhood educators if the workers are not paid a fair wage, fair benefits, and the opportunity to negotiate contracts. Ontario Greens absolutely supported an immediate increase to $25 for ECEs. I mean, my goodness, Manitoba can do it. Why can't Ontario do it? So we need to absolutely, I agree with what Ms. Horvath just said, we absolutely need to make sure that ECEs are a career that's respected, that's compensated, that has benefits, that somebody can earn enough to have a good living, caring for our children. My goodness, if we can't pay people adequately to care for our children, like, what kind of province are we really?
Mr. Del Duca, you have 30 seconds to respond to any of their comments.
Well, I think we're pretty much on the same page here in terms of recognizing just the work that you and your colleagues do as early childhood educators. I think you see three options that are all, to a large extent, similar with respect to the number of early childhood educators that we know we're going to need in a system that's going to grow by leaps and bounds, assuming that the Ford Conservatives actually take the federal money and invest it in the proper way, which I will admit here tonight I'm a little bit skeptical about given their track record, but I know that Ontario Liberals, should we form government on June 2nd, will move forward quickly on supporting ECEs, on making sure more come into the system, properly compensated as well. Thanks so much.
And now it's time. Thank you so much for your question, Jess. Now it's time for the follow-up from Carolyn. And then afterwards, we do have that 3 minutes where you can debate.
Thanks, yes, I look forward to the debate. Thank you to all of you, and I appreciate your words on the childcare workforce and how important it is. As a childcare advocate, I've worked for 20 years trying to get the federal government to engage on childcare, and I stand on the shoulders of advocates who've been working 50 years to do the same thing. And now we finally have the federal government, stepping up, making their commitment. But what I worry about is that we've gone from a place where, all I heard from provincial leaders was that, well, if there's no role for the federal government, childcare is provincial jurisdiction, to more of a message of, well, if the federal government doesn't pay for it all, there's no way we can have affordable childcare here in Ontario for everyone. So what I want to know is what you will do beyond the Canada-Ontario agreement to make sure that we have childcare that's affordable for every family, regardless of if they work non-standard hours, regardless of where they are in the province. And simple yes and no question, do you think that children in Ontario have a right to early learning and childcare? Thank you.
Good question. Any else?
So I would say that absolutely yes. Children do have a right to early learning and childcare in our province. You might know this, but I used to be the critic for childcare for the NDP, and for years and years, or maybe I should say election cycle after election cycle, we've had $10 a day childcare in our provincial platforms, because regardless of the federal promise, by the way, my son wasn't born when that promise first came out by the federal Liberals, and 30 years later, it finally arrived, and I'm happy about that. Don't get me wrong. I can work with Justin Trudeau to make it work in Ontario, but you're absolutely correct. It doesn't stop there. There's so much work to be done, and I think similarly to what we were talking about before in terms of wages, in terms of actually growing a system that hasn't existed. And we're talking about the wages that people get when they're childcare workers. I had a young woman named Savi today at my press conference. She told me she quit working as an early child care educator. Why? Because in 2017, she was only making $18 an hour and she couldn't make a living for her family. So I know we all want to look to the future, But we also have to think of missed opportunities over these number of years here in Ontario where governments could have made a difference for children and for women and families.
Mr. Del Duca, I think she was looking at you.
So I will confirm the short answer is yes, a slightly larger answer, a longer answer. In our plan, the Ontario Liberal plan to deliver on the childcare and early learning system that we need, there are some responsibilities in our plan that we would be prepared to take on as a provincial government. So earlier tonight when I talked about within 100 days of taking office, also delivering on $10 a day before and after school care, we would understand, and I believe in this so much, that we would make that happen through a provincial investment. The same thing with the top up to the 18-month parental leave program. I already talked about covering the college tuition for ECEs and making sure the salary grid is matched to full-day kindergarten. And I've also made a commitment, because I don't think Ontario families should have to suffer, because Doug Ford was the last in this country to get an agreement with the feds. We will make the child care cost retroactive, the payment from our government, retroactive to January 1st. For many families, that will mean $2,750 per child in retroactive savings. We will deliver that as well.
Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And I would say I appreciate your comments around making sure that childcare is available, non-standard working hours for people who are doing shift work, people who are not working 9 to 5. I don't know how the rest of you, and I remember the 6 o'clock rush to try to get there in time and the stress of like, am I going to be there in time or not? Am I going to pay a fine for being late? We have to utilize public assets like schools as community hubs for non-standard hour childcare for people who don't work 9 to 5.
Mr. Schreiner, Jan and I looked at each other because we were talking about this, and it kind of leads us into our next personal question. Because when I got pregnant, my son started daycare, I was actually told that I should have applied before I became pregnant because of how long the list is. And and those moments when you're rushing, like it's like, you know, when you're already late and then you become later because the universe and all those dollars you pay past 6 o'clock. So we wanted to ask another kind of personal question. As a child or as a parent, what was the main public community or social service your family relied on? Ms. Horvath, I'll start with you, and then Mr. Schreiner, and then Mr. Del Duca. You have a minute each.
Well, thanks, Nam. I just want to say that the getting on the waiting list before you're pregnant really speaks to the fact that families choose not to have a child or a second child because they can't afford the cost of childcare, which is as much as a mortgage in our province, and that should never be the case. But in terms of the question, I grew up in a working class family, so we relied on public services that every family should be able to rely on, no matter where you live or how much money you make. Things like our public healthcare system, things like our public education system. We didn't have a cottage anywhere, but we sure went to the provincial parks, and I learned how to fish in the Ontario provincial park system. But these are the basics, and you know what? Those basics are broken right now. Those basics are broken. They've been broken for a very long time, and I think COVID showed us just how broken those things are. And I want to commit to you tonight that should I get the opportunity, I'll work every day to fix these systems that have been broken in Ontario for far too long.
Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in a little community, literally in the middle of nowhere. It was a 5-hour drive to any major urban center. And that experience has made me recognize just how essential it is to have high quality public services with strong government investment in those services. You know, as a kid, I would say the school was the most important to me, not only because it employed my mom for 4 years, but it also gave me the opportunity to learn and to connect. The public library, you know, when you're a kid in a small community who enjoys reading and your family at that particular point in time couldn't afford a lot of books, like just being able to go to the library and be able to access knowledge and to have the world open to you was so vitally important. And I'll finally end with public health care. I mean, our local hospital was always hanging by a thread, but my goodness, it did serve the community.
Mr. Del Duca?
So I will say, where I grew up in Etobicoke, Eatonville Public Library, where I got my first library card in grade 1. Our class got to go there. That library is still there, although it looks an awful lot better now. It's been modernized and updated since I was growing up in that neighborhood. That's where I discovered my passion for reading, a passion that stayed with me my whole life. an Erringate public swimming pool, which is where myself and my neighborhood friends growing up literally spent every day of our youngest summers. Like I fell in love with books at Eatonville Public Library, I fell in love with swimming and being in the water at Erringate Public Swimming Pool. And, you know, as has been mentioned here tonight, this is a situation where we see in far too many communities that access to these kinds of core foundational public services that really build up and support an outstanding quality of life are just not there. They've really frayed in too many communities across Ontario. So yes, Eatonville and Erringate in Etobicoke, where I was proud to grow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, all of you. Public services are most often delivered by women workers. Areas like healthcare, education, community and social services, developmental services, elder care, women's shelters, employment centers, and much more. These are very female-dominated areas of work, and many of them are facing long-standing labor shortages. A report released this year by the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario reports that Ontario spends less money per person than other provinces on public services such as health, education, childcare, and community social services, 14.3% less than the national average. Since 2008, Ontario's program spending per capita has consistently ranked at or near the lowest among the provinces. Ontario's health spending per capita is the lowest in the country. Ontario collects less money per person through taxes and fees than all provinces other than Nova Scotia. During the pandemic, Ontario left billions of COVID-related funds unspent. In last week's Environics poll, 88% of Ontarians believe decent wages for women working in publicly funded care work and community and social services is important to promote women economic equality. 81% agree that Ontario should rebuild the economy after the pandemic by increasing funding to public services that provide care to Ontarians. 76% agree that Ontario should increase taxes on the wealthiest Ontarians to rebuild the economy after the pandemic. Let me introduce Lois Ross, who will ask the next question by video. Lois works at Addictions Counseling Service in Ottawa, and the follow-up question will be asked by Pamela Paul, Director of Policy at the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Let's watch Lois's question.
My name's Lois Ross. I work in a small nonprofit community service agency in Ottawa that provides addiction counseling and health programs to women and gender diverse clients dealing with substance use issues linked to deep trauma, often related to sexual violence as a child or adult, and often to mental health. The agency where I work provides free services for the most vulnerable. We are funded primarily by the province. Our clients come to us needing long-term counseling to empower them towards a healthier lifestyle. Our clients desperately need our services, but this pandemic deepened the opioid crisis and deepened all forms of addiction and deepened the need for our services as well. There's a 2.5-year wait list for counseling in our agency. 2.5 years. Our staff are on another kind of wait list. We are waiting for true and meaningful pay equity. I know, we were supposed to have achieved pay equity in 1994, right? In the mid-2000s, the province decided it would no longer fund pay equity for agencies like ours. Since then, our agency has been left to meet legal pay equity obligations without any increase in its core funding. Essentially, that means our nonprofit volunteer board of directors has been left to fundraise, you know, bake sales, donations, and the like, to meet pay equity. So to be clear, our public funding does not include pay equity. Our agency funding is stagnant, and our agency is underfunded given the high demand before the pandemic and the even higher demand now. Staff salaries haven't kept up. Hiring for vacancies is extremely challenging given lower wages. All of this also has an impact on clients, of course, since conditions of work have an impact on conditions of care. But we are not alone. All other social and community agencies face the same effective freeze on their budgets, and we're told, just fund your pay equity out of your base budget. I was heartened by the recent Environics poll, where 88% of respondents agreed on the importance of policies promoting decent wages for women in publicly funded care work and in community and social services. So this is my question. What will your party do to commit to pay equity and to rebuilding and meeting the demand for public services for vulnerable women and other services like those where I work?
Ms. Horvath, you'll
Thank
start, and then Mr. Schreiner, and then Mr. Del Duca. Ms. Horvath, you have 2 minutes, and then you all get 1 minute, and then 30 seconds for you to respond to their comments. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Lois, for really giving the big picture as to what's happening in the caring economy. The care economy is undervaluing women's work, and it is underpaying women and has been doing so for a long time. And people like Lois, as a leader, as a woman leader in her organization, can't even provide the pay equity increases that the women that work for her deserve and should be getting. And I can tell you it's been horrifying to watch as government after government has been dragging midwives, for example. There's a good example, through the courts instead of paying for their pay equity adjustments that they should be paying for. That's not acceptable. So absolutely, we need to make sure that the Pay Equity Commission is properly resourced to be able to make sure women are getting the pay equity adjustments that they require, but we also have to start funding mental health. We're bringing mental health into OHIP. No more using your credit card for mental health services. You can use your OHIP card. We're also increasing base funding to organizations that have been frozen for years and years. People deserve those services. They need those services. And the women who do that work deserve respect and dignity as workers.
Mr. Schreiner?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We need to put more money into our public services, into our caring economy, in those disproportionate professions that are women delivering that care. So I want to talk a bit about fiscal capacity. I'm the only MPP in the entire legislature that voted against Doug Ford's license plate gimmick to take $1.1 billion out of our provincial coffers. That's $1.1 billion. Thank you. It's $1.1 billion that actually is funding our mental health plan to make mental health available through OHIP, to increase Lois's base budget, and to reduce wait times for youth mental health to less than 30 days. I'm, I think, one of the few, if not only, MPPs who continually talk about the $7 billion we're spending as the only jurisdiction to subsidize electricity prices in the entire, all of North America, that disproportionately benefits wealthy households. You know what? Let's redirect some of that money.
That's time, Mr. Schreiner.
Oh, sorry, I saw the 30 seconds.
Okay. I messed up the time a little bit, but
no
Mr. Del
worries,
Duca,
no
go
worries.
ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, it's such an important question that Lois has raised, and it's an appalling situation. It's an appalling situation, and it has been for quite some time. I think the Ford Conservatives took a really difficult situation and made it dramatically worse because of how reckless and irresponsible their decisions have been. The care economy, to me, represents an area. We see this reflected in the Environics survey that's being discussed here tonight, where more and more Ontarians understand we have to get it right, because it is so, again, it provides that floor of support, that safety net of support. But it's also a huge economic opportunity for this province in terms of a potential growth sector for women in particular, if we invest in it the proper way, if we support the decisions that are made in a very thoughtful and deliberate way to make sure that that caring economy can grow in the way that it needs to. And Ontario Liberals will make sure that that happens.
Ms. Horvath, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Thanks very much, Nama. I guess I have to say that I was disappointed, as many of you here were, for years and years. We saw a Liberal government that froze the funding for so many organizations, to the point where we ended up having wait lists for children's mental health services that were over 18 months. How do you prevent, or how do you not provide children's mental health services? We know what it means if kids don't get the services they need. Their crisis deepens. So it's easy to talk about the future, but I think we have to acknowledge that if we're going to really make things change in this province, we need to put a government in that's prepared to fix what other governments have been breaking for a very long time.
Mr. Del Duca, you might get a chance to respond to that in the 3-minute interaction. Okay. But first, we have a follow-up from Pamela. Sure. Pamela, go ahead.
Thank you for your remarks on the care economy. So since March 2020, Ontario nonprofits have been at the forefront of fighting COVID-19, from emergency childcare, mental health supports, meal delivery for isolated seniors, vaccinating hard-to-reach populations, to supporting communities through arts and sports programming. Much of this work is funded by various provincial government ministries through transfer payment agreements and grants. So 2 years later, nonprofits are facing an HR crisis, decreased revenues, and, as you have all shared, increased demand for services. Essential workers are burnt out in our sector. Funding is not keeping up with the cost of delivering true services with antiquated funding agreements, and the sector is bound to wage constraint legislations, making it difficult to recruit and retain workers. 77% of our workers in the sector are women, particularly Black, newcomer, and other racialized women. People like Gloria, Jess, and Louis are part of our sector. Their wages and working conditions do not reflect the value of their work. In other words, it's low paid and devalued because so many women and racialized women work in our sector. Women working in nonprofits are not only making less in comparison to the average Ontario wage, but less than those doing the same job in other sectors, and less than men within our own sector. We will not close the gender wage gap until we lift women workers in nonprofits. This actually drives down women's economic equality overall. So I ask again, what will your party do to improve women's wages and working conditions in provincially funded programs?
Great question.
Mr. Schreiner, you go first.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pam. I would say the Ontario Greens are absolutely committed immediately to providing the $680 million stabilization fund the Ontario Nonprofit Network has been asking for. But we know that's not going to be enough, but at the very least, the organizations that have been overworked and under-resourced through this entire pandemic need to be supported with the stabilization funding. And this gets back to, and I know my time was cut short, we have to decide as a province what our priorities are, and we have to be honest with people about that. Nam, when she opened this question, she said, and she's right, we have the lowest per capita funding of public services, healthcare, education, post-secondary education, any province in the country. We have the lowest per capita revenue, any province in the country. Our students pay the highest tuition rates, any province in the country. There has to be a moment in time where there is a reckoning, where we have to be honest with people and say, you know what? We can't have license plate gimmicks. We can't have cuts to the gas tax. We can't continue to spend $7 billion a year subsidizing electricity prices for wealthy people in this province. Yeah, let's support subsidies for low income and working folks who are struggling to pay their bills. But my gosh, let's redirect that money to making sure people have a home, to make sure people have access to mental health services, to healthcare services, to make sure we have pay equity within our nonprofit organizations and our caring economy. We are a wealthy province. And so we have to step up as a province and have an honest conversation about how we're going to pay for the services that people need and ensure that the workers who deliver those services are paid the fair wages they deserve.
Mr. Del Duca, do you want to step in?
Yeah, I mean, I would make to echo some of what Mr. Schreiner said a second ago. Like so many other things in governing, it is about being deliberate with the choices that you make. I acknowledge this in my opening answer to this particular segment. What we've seen over the past couple of years from the Ford Conservatives took a difficult situation that has existed for some time. I can acknowledge that openly, but they made it dramatically worse because their deliberate choices over the past couple of years in particular, I feel that their approach has been callous and cruel. And really hasn't taken advantage of the opportunity to provide real funding to support the care economy and the not-for-profit sector, but to also recognize it as a potential economic driver for the next number of months and years ahead.
Ms.
I said this
Horvath?
earlier.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please,
we need time for Ms. Horvath.
And so these are some of the things that I think COVID has laid bare for all of the rest of the people in this province to understand, but you've been dealing with and living with for a very long time. And there's just no doubt that government after government has been underfunding the not-for-profit sector. Absolutely, that needs to stop. But it can never slide back again if we're going to make real progress, not only on the equity piece, but on providing the kind of supports people in our province deserve and need, and that you all deliver.
We have about 30 minutes left, and for anybody who might be joining us online, and you might be wondering why Mr. Ford isn't here, I just wanted to say that he was invited, but he has a scheduling conflict, and we're very grateful that the three of you have spent some time with us. Our next question is somewhat related to what we were just talking about. It deals with Bill 124 and Bill 106. These are laws that affect wages of workers delivering public services like healthcare, education, community, and social services. Again, most of these workers are women. Bill 124 was introduced in 2019. It prohibits unions in the public and broader public sectors from bargaining wage increases above 1% per year for 3 years. Bill 106 was introduced last week. It gives the government power to make compensation enhancements to workers delivering public services. But it allows government to change wages without agreement of the union and prevents unions from filing complaints. It also affects the pay equity rights of women delivering public services. To ask about Bill 124 and Bill 106, let me introduce Patty Coates. Patty is the first woman to become the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and the follow-up question will be asked by Equal Pay Coalition co-chair Jan Borway. Patty?
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for being here. I'm an educational assistant by trade. My past colleagues have shared their first-hand accounts about working through the COVID-19 pandemic. At the height of the pandemic, they were working in schools with children, students with special needs. They worked tirelessly in head-to-toe PPE, if they had it available to them. These workers are disproportionately women and make an average of $30,000 a year. Bill 124 limits wage and benefit increases far below inflation, and Bill 106 takes rights away from workers and their unions to fair collective bargaining and prevents unions from filing complaints. In reality, both bills, 124 and 106, is a union-busting bill. Both of these bills have been detrimental impact on frontline workers. So my question to each of you is, do you understand the impacts of Bill 124, especially given the rise in cost of living? And will you repeal Bill 124 and 106 if you are elected in June?
Mr. Schreiner, you can start. You have 1 minute, and everybody else has 30 seconds. And then Mr. Schreiner, you have 30 seconds afterwards. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll repeal Bill 124. And we are calling on the Ford government to immediately remove Schedule 7 from Bill 106, which takes away workers' bargaining rights. Let's first of all, I want to say something to you, Patty, about being an educational assistant. Like, my goodness, not providing educational assistance with PPE, and the more and more educational assistants I meet with, how many have to wear like Kevlar into the classroom at times because we have so underfunded the supports for students with special needs, which is exactly why we need to increase investments in the caring economy. Bill 124 is an absolute insult. Every time the Premier, Mr. Ford, says healthcare heroes, it infuriates me because how can you call somebody a hero when you cap their compensation at 1%, which is essentially a pay cut when inflation is 5%? It has to go.
Mr. Del Duca?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Patty. Great to see you here, and thank you for the question. So yes, Ontario Liberals will move urgently post-June 2nd, should we earn the honor of governing this province, to repeal Bill 124. And as you pointed out, Bill 106 sort of adds insult to injury and makes it quite clear that despite all of the advocacy, despite all of the opposition parties saying the same thing in unison on this topic, that the Ford Conservatives simply cannot help themselves. And it's even more farcical because we've heard them try to talk a good game over the past year about how they really want to support workers and their families. All of the empty words that the Ford Conservatives deliver from podiums, and then they abandon workers and their families in this province. We'll get it done in the right way.
Ms. Horvath?
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question, Patty, and yay, first woman president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and thank you all. Yes. thank you all for the work that you're doing on and have been on Bill 124 and other wage cap bills and pulling away of collective bargaining rights of workers. It's not a new tactic. Other governments have done it. In fact, 115, we just paid the $100 million settlement from that anti-labor legislation. But look, the only way we're going to actually stop Bill 124 and Bill 106 is to not elect Doug Ford. That's what we have to do. That's our job.
Mr. Schreiner, you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't know how many times, I honestly don't know how many times the Ford government has to hear how wrong Bill 124 is. I don't know how many times they have to hear that bill disproportionately and negatively affects women. You know what? There are other public sector job categories that are predominantly men who Bill 124 does not apply to. And so what does it say about this government that they would go to such extreme measures?
That's time.
Thanks.
I'm so sorry. I feel
That's
so horrible.
fine.
I'm a bad moderator.
You're doing a great job. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's very kind. We have a follow-up from Jen, and then the 3 minutes. This is your last 3 minutes to.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. I'll be brief. But I do want to focus a bit on Bill 106.
Yes.
It's called the Emergency Preparedness Act. And quite frankly, on Thursday of last week when I woke up in the morning and heard about it, I thought I'd woken up in 1995 again.
Yeah.
This is a bill that is, the reality check is, this isn't any different than what we saw in 1995 with the repeal of union rights, and frankly, with the complete dismantling of proxy comparison pay equity rights for women who are working in those nonprofits, who are in female-dominated workplaces, like everybody you've heard from today. You know, and then, quite frankly, I thought, maybe I'm back to 2013 in Bill 115, which was wage restraint legislation under the Liberals, where the unions had to fight for years to say it's unconstitutional. That's not good enough. I mean, perhaps we should call this new bill the Groundhog Day Act, because every time we pop up, we see something worse. In any event, my question is two parts. Will you repeal Bill 106? It's unconstitutional. It's a brutal attack on the pay equity rights for women working in female-dominated workplaces. Will you repeal it in your first 100 days? And the second part of my question is, will you in government commit to not introducing unconstitutional legislation that either eradicates bargaining rights or eradicates pay equity?
Great stuff. Any one of us?
So can I just say, first of all, yes and yes. I will repeal 124. I will repeal 106. And I will also commit to doing what I committed to in the last election and the election before that. Well, we were told by the premier of the day that this is a tool for governments. Taking away people's constitutional rights to collectively bargain somehow is a tool that governments are allowed to use. And she convinced people that that's the reason why you should not vote for the NDP, because guess what? That's going to take away the government's tool. And I'd have to say I was offended by that, and I know a lot of working people were offended by that. But I know who I work for. I know whose side I'm on before an election, during an election, and after an election. And so I can easily guarantee exactly that. It costs more money in the long run. It takes away people's rights, their constitutionally protected rights, and it should never be a tool of government. And so we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to prevent these things from happening again? We're going to prevent them from happening again by defeating Doug Ford, getting rid of these bills, and electing a government that's committed to respecting the constitutionally protected rights of working people in this province. There are ways that we can make sure that is how we roll in Ontario, and it's shameful that we are a Groundhog Day kind of in a Groundhog Day situation in our province. It should
Mr.
never be
Delduca?
that way.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And so let me just say yes and yes to Bill 124 and Bill 106. I'll also say, for those who don't know in the audience, prior to becoming an MPP, I had the honor for just over 6 years to work for a labor organization, for the Carpenters District Council of Ontario, and to do what I could in that capacity to stand up and defend the rights of workers to free and fair collective bargaining. This is a principle that's near and dear to my heart. and it's something that we have to ensure. And I know that there's a way to do this in the province. It is to elect a government that is progressive, that is truly on the side of workers and their families. But your question about 124 and 106, the answer is yes. Thank you.
Mr. Schreiner?
Answer is yes to 106, yes to 114, and I opposed Bill 115 back in the day, even though I wasn't an MPP. I remember going out and being a part of labor protests against that particular bill. And you know what? Also going to fight against what we know are going to be austerity measures that this government is bringing, the Ford government is bringing forward. I mean, we've already seen the FAO reports that are where the government's underfunding public services. They're now talking about a balanced budget in a year. Like literally after a pandemic, like we don't need austerity. We cannot have austerity in this province as we recover from COVID. We need to invest in good public services.
Do you know they actually tabled Bill 106 for debate today in the legislature on equal pay
Equal pay day,
How
yes, true.
disgraceful and shameful is that?
And I think all of us are going to probably commit to doing everything we can to fight against it before it actually finally passes.
And make sure Doug Ford doesn't get
again.
reelected,
Exactly.
so he can't bring in austerity measures. That's the job that we have, friends.
Okay, there's too much agreement here.
Okay.
That's the job that we have.
We're wrapping up, and we're going to do the next two questions differently. We'll ask the question, and then each leader will have 1 minute each to give a quick response.
Okay.
Our first question is about pay transparency, of course, equal pay day. Pay transparency laws require employers to make their pay structures public. They don't disclose individuals' pay, they disclose what different jobs are paid. What the pay gap is between women and men in that workplace, and how workers are distributed by gender at different income levels. Ontario introduced Canada's first Pay Transparency Act in 2018. It was supposed to come into effect at the beginning of 2019, but in December 2018, the government put it on pause. To ask about pay transparency, we have Maida Yaza, past president of the Business and Professional Women of Ontario and chair of Resolutions, Provincial Council of Women of Ontario. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nam. Pay transparency is the practice of sharing salary information with employees. It's our right to know the pay structures of our jobs and any compensation differences by gender. When we think about the economic gaps experienced by women, we have to think about the issues over a lifetime of work and its impact on retirement income. The gender pay gap can affect women from their first jobs right through into retirement. Pay discrimination through their lives can mean their pension is also affected. Gender pay gaps have been illegal since 1952. However, women cannot practice that right without information. Pay transparency requires employers to disclose the wage structure in their workplaces. It's not publishing salaries in a newspaper. It's not a sunshine list. It's the individual work group issue. The transparency reveals where men and women are paid differently for the same work, where women are underpaid because their work is undervalued, and it can also reveal concentrations where precariousness of work is revealed. We know that gender pay gaps shrink when companies are required to disclose them. Public salary disclosure is becoming law in even more countries, with reporting of wage statistics broken down by gender. Our Pay Transparency Act in Ontario was passed on April 26, 2018, yay, and has never come into force. It applies to public and private sector employees, first tranche being 250 plus, second tranche being 100 plus employees with no exemptions. My question to you is in three parts, but basically, what are you going to do about it? Will you implement the Pay Transparency Act that's already in the books, take it to the Lieutenant Governor, have her sign it, and then put it into action? Will you make it stronger by making sure it applies to all employers with more than 10 workers? And will you ensure disclosure of both gender and racial pay gaps? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll start with Ms. Horvath, Mr. Schreiner, and then Mr. Del Duca, and you each have 1 minute.
So thank you for that, and thank you for all the great work you're doing on pay transparency. I'll be brief. Yes, yes, and yes. I think it's really troubling that we were this close and that it took until right before an election for this bill to be brought forward and passed. And we don't have that kind of time to waste. Every year, it continues to be problematic that we cannot have that transparency, and so women can't get the economic justice that they deserve, and we can't effectively close the gender wage gap. So yes, we need to do that, and I can't believe that here we are in 2022 still having this conversation. It is absolutely astounding to me that that is the case. And so we have some important decisions to make. This is going to be an extremely important election, and I think we have an opportunity to really fix some of these problems. But to do that, and I've said it a number of times, I'm going to say it again, we have to defeat Doug Ford. And with all due respect to my friends on this stage, the NDP is the only party that's in a position to do that in this election. So
that's time,
it's
Mr.
something
Schreiner.
to think about.
So yes, and yes. Women have been fighting for way too long for pay equity and to close the wage gap. And we know that the Transparency Act is a critical tool in enabling to do that. We've seen other jurisdictions pass pay transparency acts, and it's helped put them on a pathway to closing the gender wage gap and also the racial wage gap, quite frankly, which for racialized women is even higher than non-racialized women. The one thing that infuriates me at times with the Conservative government is they say they believe in markets. Well, markets can't function if you don't have transparent information for the markets to actually function properly. And that's exactly what a Pay Transparency Act does. It provides the public, businesses, workers, everybody with the information they need to bargain to enable the closing of that wage gap.
Mr. Del Duca?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, across the board to the three aspects of pay transparency that you raised. This is an important part of the announcement that I made earlier today, the Ontario Liberal Plan for Equal Pay and Equal Opportunity for Women in this province. I'm also a really big believer in measuring progress. Sometimes in politics, a lot of politicians issue platitudes and empty words, but if you want to see progress is not guaranteed. You have to measure what you're doing. You can't appropriately measure the progress in closing the pay gap without measuring it in a way that's transparent and having that information. We can't wait 4 years, we can't wait 3, we can't even really wait 2 or any extended period of time. Ontario Liberals will move on this urgently so that it's no longer sitting on a shelf collecting dust because the Ford Conservatives have ignored it. We will move on it quickly because it's the right thing to do, and that's how we're going to measure our progress as we deliver it.
Okay, we've got one last quick comment. Thank you so much. You've all been such great sports, and thank you for all the questions from our members here. The gender pay gap has barely changed in the last 2 decades, maybe in the last 50 years. Courts and tribunals have said that governments must use an intersectional gender-based analysis in policy development. That means that before implementing a law or policy, they must analyze what effect it will have on promoting equality. So the question is, how will your government ensure that gender-based analysis is done to make sure its policies will close the gender pay gap? We'll start with you, Mr. Schreiner. You've got a minute.
Yeah, by actually bringing a intersectional lens to all the legislation that we consider and that we pass. We have to understand how the multiple social and environmental determinants of health and people's lives intersect in things like the gender wage gap, the racial wage gap, the wage gap for non-binary, trans, LGBTQ plus 2IA individuals. And we have to make sure that we look at all pieces of legislation through that lens and that we pass laws that enable government to do that.
Mr. Del Duca, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, so again, agreeing with Mr. Schreiner, when I said a second ago that the best way to deliver progress is to measure what you're doing in that open and transparent way, bringing that intersectional analysis, that gender analysis, to me is not simply about doing no more harm. I mean, to me, that's not good enough anymore because the struggle, the advocacy, the fight you've been engaged on has been going on for far too long. It has to be better than simply do no harm. It's about how proactively we can figure out ways to do things better in the first instance so that we're not trying to make up for lost time for generations. We are well past that point, and Ontario Liberals will bring forward the mechanisms to make sure that we are delivering at the front end rather than simply trying to catch up and keep up later on, because that's just not good enough.
Ms. Horvath?
Thanks very much. There's no doubt that the gender wage gap is one that needs to be closed, and we have to do it in an intersectional way. We need to have the voices of people at the table, making those decisions and putting those policies in place. So that means absolutely women, but it also means Black women, Indigenous, racialized. We need to see people who are 2S LGBTQIA plus people at the table, and I can tell you, you can do it. It can be done, and so we just have to do it. I sit at a caucus table with extremely rich diversity, and we have those conversations, not in policy making, but in how do we argue against the terrible policies that the Ford government's putting in place. And those voices are there, and they have to be there. We know in the public service writ large, those voices aren't there, and when they are, they're not being given the proper space to contribute. And so those pieces, those systemic pieces, have to be fixed as well.
Thank you all so much. We've put a lot of questions to you, and now as we approach the close of this evening's program, I want to give you a chance to leave us with your final thoughts, and we'll end the way we started. Mr. Del Duca, you'll go first, Ms. Horvath, and then Mr. Schreiner, and you have 1 minute to give us your closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Nam. First of all, you did an outstanding job. I know we
very
already clapped a little bit earlier tonight, but you were phenomenal.
Thank you.
Phenomenal.
Thank you.
And of course, I want to thank the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition and everyone who was here tonight, in particular those individuals who stepped up to ask questions of us, questions that were so on point, of course, given what we're here to talk about tonight. And just a moment ago, when I was answering one of the questions, I talked about how progress isn't guaranteed, and I think that's something that we have to remember. You know, I wish we didn't live in a province, given all of our capacity, where the kind of advocacy that you have brought forward tonight and have for years wasn't as necessary as it is. But it's clear, because progress isn't guaranteed, we still have to do this work. You're doing it in such a phenomenal way, but it falls to all of us, in particular those of us who aspire to be the next premier of this province, to be very clear about how we will deliver the progress. And you've made this process so good for us tonight. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your efforts, thank you for your guidance, and I look forward to having the chance to work closely with you for many, many years to come. Thank you very much.
Ms. Horvath?
I also want to thank the coalition for this event this evening, and thank you for those thoughtful questions. We had a really great conversation tonight. As you saw, there was a lot of agreement in the room. But the question now is, how do we take this from conversation to action? That's where we are now. And so what we need to consider is who is going to have the ability to defeat Doug Ford and start delivering on the commonalities that we discussed, on these things that we all agree need to be done. And I can say with all sincerity that I need your vote. I need your vote to do that. You know why? Because we, the NDP, are as few as 10 seats away from forming government in a couple weeks' time. That is the job at hand, and that is something that I can commit to you, is that when I form government in Ontario, I will be implementing all of the things that we've talked about, but we have to do that together. And that's what I'm looking forward to being able to do. So thank you all so much for
Mr.
tonight.
Schreiner?
Well, thank you, Nam, and thank you for the coalition for bringing us together, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want you to think a moment about the Ontario you want to build, and then the kind of leadership it's going to take to build it. We cannot afford to wait any longer to address so many of the issues that you brought up tonight. And we've had successive governments over and over again over the years not deliver on that. And so I think it's time for a party with new solutions to old problems, new ideas to hold the older line parties accountable. And the only way I can do that is to elect more Green MPPs. I think most people have thought we've punched well above our weight with one Green MPP and delivered things for people. Imagine what we can do with more, building the Ontario you want, providing the leadership we need.
Thank you all so much. Jana and Faye will come up for final thoughts.
So as we bring our evening to a close, I want to thank all of you for being part of this incredible historic event. This has been an important time to have this conversation, and it shouldn't be another 50 years before we do it again. This should be a regular event. I want to say thank you to all of you, Ms. Horvath, Mr. Del Duca, Mr. Schreiner. Thank you so much for showing up for women this evening, and we look forward to seeing how you'll show up for women in the weeks ahead. I want to thank you as well for exchanging your ideas in a way that was constructive, that was thoughtful, that allowed us to understand what your policies are and what the differences between them are. And I want to give a big thank you to Nam Kiwanuka. Who brought us through that excellent conversation. I want to say thank you to everyone who asked questions this evening and brought your stories forward. I want to give a special thank you to Pamela Cousineau and Corinne Rosbach, who have been doing the French interpretation for our live streams tonight. Thank you, Pamela and Corinne. Thank you to Ian Logan and the team from USW 1998, who are the members here at Innis Town Hall who've helped put this event together. Thank you to Alex Maven, to Jen and Dorian and the rest of the team from Bespoke AV, who are the camera crew who've been doing the filming and handling the live streams. A big thank you to Kate Fain, Alexandra Yaboa, Samantha Jeroff, who have been the organizers and the support team for us on the coalition. But especially, I want to say thank you to all the members of the Equal Pay Coalition and to all of our feminist elders who've been fighting this fight for many, many decades. It's always a joy, always a pleasure to work with you, and we are always stronger together. So thank you so much for making this possible. And that's a wrap.
Sure, whatever. Nam wants to do a selfie.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, everyone. Great. I see you. Okay, yeah, good.
I think we're taking them off.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
please. Yeah, thank you.
A little bit further.
Can you see us?
Yeah, I do. Okay. Nice spacing too.